Carolina is trapped in a life filled with expectations, but one night at a party, everything changes. Her boyfriend, Mauricio, proposes in front of everyone, and Carolina faces the weight of what is expected. But instead of saying yes, she defies the crowd and says no. As the tension builds, Carolina's secret, a pregnancy, is revealed, and her decision to follow her own path sets the stage for a confrontation with her family, forcing her to choose between tradition and independence.
The room shimmered under the warm glow of chandeliers, their golden light casting a soft glow over the elegantly dressed guests. Carolina stood near the corner, her back pressed against the cool surface of the wall, trying to blend into the background. The event was in her honor, yet she felt like a guest in her own life. Her parents had spared no expense, making sure every person of importance in their social circle was present. They all milled about, unaware of the storm building inside Carolina. She clenched her champagne flute a little tighter, her nerves buzzing beneath her calm facade. Mauricio, her boyfriend of 2 years, was talking animatedly to a group of colleagues nearby, his deep laugh cutting through the hum of the crowd. He was everything her parents wanted in a son-in-law, successful, well-mannered, and from a family of old money. Carolina knew exactly what tonight would bring. She had sensed the shift in the way her mother had been hovering around her recently, dropping hints, all too eager for her daughter to follow the well-trodden path of women in their family, marriage, children, and a life of social obligations. As she took a sip of champagne, her mother appeared at her side, her sharp eyes scanning the room with approval. "Isn't it a beautiful night, dear?" her mother asked, though it wasn't really a question. Carolina could only nod, her throat tight. The music softened, and in an instant, all eyes turned toward the center of the room. The crowd parted slightly, revealing Mauricio, now standing alone, a small velvet box in his hand. The world seemed to freeze, every sound dropping away until only her heart beating in her ears remained. She felt it coming. The proposal. The one moment that was supposed to define the rest of her life, except it wasn't. Not for her. Mauricio smiled confidently, his gaze locked on hers as he slowly dropped to one knee. Gasps of approval rose from the crowd, her mother beaming with pride just behind her. Carolina's mind raced, her vision narrowing on that small box, that symbol of everything she didn't want but couldn't escape. She knew what was expected of her, what everyone assumed would happen. But the weight of it all, the pressure of playing a role she hadn't chosen, began to suffocate her. "Carolina, will you marry me?" Mauricio's voice was steady, full of certainty. He opened the box, revealing a brilliant diamond ring that sparkled under the chandelier's light. Time seemed to stretch. Her pulse throbbed in her temples. The room was silent, everyone waiting for her to speak, for her to say the only thing she was supposed to say, yes. But she couldn't. Carolina's throat closed up, and her vision blurred as she glanced around the room. Every face was expectant, hopeful, waiting for her to conform, to fulfill the dream they had all laid out for her. A dream that wasn't hers. And then, the words came, quietly at first, but gaining strength with every syllable. "No," she said, her voice almost lost in the vast space of the ballroom. She saw the confusion on Mauricio's face, the frown forming as he stood up. "What?" he whispered, clearly not expecting this answer. Carolina straightened her spine, her voice firm now. "I can't marry you, Mauricio. I don't want this." The air seemed to crackle with tension. A wave of whispers swept through the crowd like a gust of wind, faces twisted in disbelief, her mother's sharp intake of breath audible behind her. Carolina felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, the crushing weight of their disappointment settling over her like a blanket. Mauricio's hand dropped to his side, his expression shifting from confusion to embarrassment. His voice lowered, an edge of anger creeping in. "You're serious? Here? Now?" Carolina could only nod, feeling both terrified and strangely liberated. It was as if she had been holding her breath for years, and now, finally, she could exhale. "I'm sorry, but this isn't what I want." The whispers grew louder, and Carolina's father stepped forward, his face a mask of control but his eyes flashing with fury. "Carolina," he said, his voice tight with the effort to keep it level, "we need to discuss this." But Carolina had made up her mind. This wasn't just about Mauricio. This was about her, about choosing her own path, and she wasn't going to back down. The car ride home from the party was suffocating. The silence in the vehicle felt more oppressive than any words could have. Carolina sat in the back seat, staring out of the window, watching the city lights blur as her father's car sped through the quiet streets. Her mother sat in the front, her back rigid and unmoving, while her father gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. No one had spoken a word since they left the party. Carolina knew what awaited her at home. Her family's house, large, pristine, and always perfectly in order, wasn't just a home, it was a reflection of everything they valued: respectability, reputation, tradition. And tonight, she had shattered all of it. As they pulled into the long driveway, the tension in the car reached a breaking point. The moment they stepped into the house, her father turned on her, the door barely closed behind them. "What in God's name were you thinking, Carolina?" His voice was sharp, filled with anger that had been simmering since the moment she'd said no. Her mother, always composed in public, now looked at her with cold disappointment, as if Carolina had personally insulted everything she held dear. "I wasn't thinking about the family's reputation," Carolina said, keeping her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I was thinking about myself." "Yourself?" Her mother finally spoke, her tone icy. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know the embarrassment you've caused, not just to Mauricio, but to all of us?" Carolina sighed, the weight of her decision pressing down harder now that she was face to face with the consequences. But despite the looming confrontation, she felt a flicker of relief. She had expected this: the anger, the accusations, the guilt. She had been bracing for it since the moment she had realized she couldn't go through with the proposal. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't marry him. I don't love him," Carolina replied, her voice softer now, hoping they could see reason. "Love?" Her father practically spat the word. "What does love have to do with any of this? Mauricio is a good man, from a good family. He can provide for you, he wants to provide for you. And this is how you repay him?" Carolina could feel the tension rising in her chest again. It was always the same with them. Everything was about appearances, about doing what was expected. There was no room for what she truly wanted, what would make her happy. Her mother stepped closer, her expression softening just enough to seem almost pitying. "Carolina, we've been patient. We've let you follow your little career dreams, live on your own, pretend that you're independent. But now, it's time to grow up. You're not getting any younger, and this was your chance. Don't throw away everything for some fantasy of freedom." Carolina's temper flared. "This isn't a fantasy. I'm not asking for anything outrageous, I just want to live my life on my own terms. Is that so hard to understand?" Her father shook his head, his voice low and full of barely contained rage. "You're being selfish, Carolina. You've always been selfish, but this is too far. Do you understand what people will say? How we'll look?" She could feel the walls closing in on her, their words heavy with decades of expectations she had never agreed to. And yet, she felt something solidifying inside her, a growing resolve. "You're right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I am thinking about myself, because for once, I need to. I can't spend my whole life trying to make you happy while ignoring what I need." Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what exactly do you need, Carolina? Because from where I'm standing, all you're doing is rejecting everything we've ever given you." The word reject stung, but Carolina held her ground. "I'm not rejecting you. I'm rejecting the idea that my only worth comes from following the path you laid out for me. I want more than that." Her father's face hardened further. "This is unacceptable. You need to fix this, Carolina. Apologize to Mauricio. This engagement isn't over." Her heart raced as she realized this conversation was going nowhere. They weren't listening. They weren't ever going to understand. The pressure felt like a physical weight on her chest, but she couldn't give in. "No, Dad," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "The engagement is over, and I'm not fixing it." The room seemed to vibrate with the force of her words. Her father stared at her, his eyes dark with anger. Her mother, visibly shaking with disappointment, turned away from her as if she could no longer bear to look at her own daughter. Carolina stood in the heavy silence that followed, knowing she had crossed a line she could never uncross. Carolina's apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that felt thick, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. The city buzzed outside her window, the distant hum of cars and the occasional siren cutting through the night, but none of it reached her. She sat curled up on the edge of her couch, staring at the glass of water in her hands as though it held answers she wasn't ready to confront. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table for the 100th time that evening. She didn't need to look to know who it was: her mother, her father, and probably even Mauricio, each trying to force her back into the mold she had just shattered. She couldn't face them, not yet. She needed space to breathe, to think about what came next. Rejecting Mauricio at the party had felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. But now, with the adrenaline fading, the consequences of that moment were catching up to her. Her parents would never forgive her for this public embarrassment, and she knew that Mauricio, though decent, had always seen their future through the lens of what would make sense, not what would make her happy. But none of them understood. None of them knew what she had been carrying for weeks. Carolina rested a hand over her stomach, her fingers brushing lightly against the soft fabric of her dress. The secret she had been holding onto felt more real now, more pressing. She was pregnant, and she had known for a while. The moment she saw the test results, a million questions had flooded her mind. Could she tell her family? How would they react? Would they force her into marrying Mauricio out of obligation? She hadn't told anyone, not even Mauricio. She couldn't bear the thought of being trapped in a marriage, or worse, in a life that wasn't her own, just because of the expectations others had for her. The child she carried wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. A choice she had made for herself, in the midst of a life where so few decisions truly felt like they were hers. But now, that choice was beginning to ripple outward. Carolina's hand trembled slightly as she thought of the confrontation with her parents. Her father's cold fury, her mother's disapproving silence. What would they say if they knew about the baby? Would they try to guilt her into an even deeper submission, telling her that, for the sake of the child, she had to marry Mauricio? She couldn't allow that to happen. Carolina knew deep down that this was the time to make a stand, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. This baby wasn't a problem to be solved, a secret to be hidden. It was the start of a new chapter, one that she had the power to write on her own terms, but it was still terrifying. Could she do this? Could she really raise a child on her own? She had spent her whole life proving she could be independent, but this was different. Her thoughts spiraled, her mind filled with doubt and fear. Yet, underneath it all, there was also a sense of quiet strength, a small but persistent voice reminding her of the freedom she had fought so hard for. She got up from the couch and walked to the window, looking out over the glowing city below. It was a Friday night, and the streets were alive with people living their lives, people who, like her, were trying to carve out their own path. She couldn't help but wonder how many of them had faced the kind of suffocating pressure she had, and how many had chosen to break free. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she picked it up. There were several missed calls from her mother, but it was a message from Mauricio that caught her eye. "We need to talk. I don't understand what's happening. Please, let me come over." Carolina sighed, feeling the weight of his words. She had to tell him, but she wasn't ready for that conversation yet. She wasn't sure how he would react, or if he would try to force her into a life she no longer wanted. But she knew that hiding the truth wasn't an option. If she was going to reclaim her life, she had to do it with honesty, no matter how difficult that might be. For now, though, she needed to make one decision clear in her mind. She wasn't going back. There would be no marriage, no compromise, no bending under the pressure of what her family wanted. This was her life, and from this moment on, it was going to be on her terms. Carolina sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, the morning sun casting long shadows across the floor. She had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning as her mind replayed the confrontation with her parents and the weight of the secret she had yet to reveal. But today, there was no avoiding it. She had agreed to meet her family for brunch at their home, and she knew this conversation couldn't be delayed any longer. As she stirred her coffee absently, the reality of what she was about to do weighed heavily on her. It wasn't just about breaking free from her parents' expectations anymore. The baby inside her was growing, and soon, it wouldn't just be her secret. Sooner or later, they'd have to know. Better to face it now than allow it to become something they could use against her later. With a deep breath, Carolina got ready to leave, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach tighten with every step toward the door. As she closed it behind her, she tried to steady her mind, repeating to herself that this was her choice. No matter how they reacted, she had to remember that she was doing this for herself, and for the child she carried. The drive to her parents' house felt endless. Each mile brought her closer to the inevitable clash, and by the time she arrived, her nerves were frayed. The house loomed in front of her, its pristine white walls and manicured lawn standing in stark contrast to the chaos she felt inside. Her parents were already seated in the dining room when she arrived. The atmosphere was thick with tension, though they both tried to maintain their usual calm composure. Her mother offered her a strained smile as Carolina sat down, while her father remained stoic, his eyes betraying his lingering anger from the night of the party. "We're glad you could make it," her mother said, her tone attempting to smooth over the obvious discomfort. But the undercurrent of disapproval was clear. They had gathered here to fix things, to bring her back into line, and Carolina could feel the weight of that expectation pressing down on her. "I'm sure you know why we wanted to talk," her father began, his voice low and measured. "We need to discuss what happened the other night." Carolina nodded, her heart pounding. This was it. There was no turning back now. I know you're both upset, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but I need you to understand something. My decision at the party wasn't impulsive. I thought about it for a long time, and it's not something I regret. Her father's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. I don't want to marry Mauricio, she said firmly. I don't love him, and it wouldn't be fair to either of us if I went through with it just because it's what's expected. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could speak, Carolina took a deep breath and plunged into the truth she had been holding back. And there's something else. Something I need you both to know. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she pushed through. I'm pregnant. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Her mother's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock, while her father's expression darkened immediately. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if trying to steady himself against the news. What did you just say? Her mother whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm pregnant, Carolina repeated, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm going to have a baby. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment, Carolina thought she might faint. Her father, however, reacted with cold fury. And you think this revelation, justifies your behavior? He snapped. Do you expect us to condone this? Out of wedlock? Without a husband? What exactly is your plan, Carolina? To disgrace this family even further? Carolina straightened in her seat, her resolve hardening. She had expected this. She had known they would react this way, but it didn't make the sting of their rejection any less painful. I'm not asking for your approval, she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. I'm telling you because you deserve to know. But I'm going to raise this baby on my own, with or without your support. Her mother finally found her voice, though it was shaky. This is madness, Carolina. You can't possibly think this is a good idea. A child needs stability, a father. What will people say? Carolina's frustration flared. I don't care what people say. I'm not going to marry someone just because it's what's expected of me. I can raise this baby without being trapped in a life I don't want. Her father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're throwing your life away, he said coldly. And don't expect us to stand by and watch you make a mockery of everything we've worked for. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but Carolina stood her ground. I'm not throwing my life away, she said quietly. I'm choosing it. This is my decision, and it's final. With that, she stood, leaving the table and the house behind, knowing that the rejection she had feared for so long had finally come to pass. The days following Carolina's revelation passed in a haze of tension and isolation. The rejection from her parents had been swift and brutal. She hadn't expected them to embrace her decision, but the complete severing of their relationship had still come as a painful shock. Her mother hadn't called, not even once, and her father had made it clear that they were finished with her. They saw her choice as a disgrace, a betrayal, and there was no room for discussion. Carolina tried to focus on her work, throwing herself into her projects at the office, but even there, whispers seemed to follow her. Word of the broken engagement and her pregnancy had spread quickly through their social circle. It felt like everywhere she turned, someone was casting a judgmental glance or avoiding her altogether. She wasn't naive, she knew how people like them worked. A scandal like this wasn't something they would forget easily. She could handle the whispers, though. It was the silence from the people who had once been closest to her that hurt the most. Her best friend, Clara, hadn't called since the night of the party. Carolina had tried reaching out, but every attempt was met with cold indifference or avoidance. Clara was a part of that world, too, one where reputation and appearances mattered more than loyalty. And now, it seemed, Carolina was too much of a liability to keep close. Sitting in her apartment late one evening, Carolina felt the weight of her solitude more acutely than ever. The city outside her window was alive with movement and noise, but here, in her small space, everything felt quiet. Too quiet. The loneliness crept in, even as she told herself she had made the right choice. She placed a hand on her growing belly, the faint swell reminding her that she wasn't truly alone. But the truth was, this was only the beginning. Raising a child on her own wasn't going to be easy, and she had to start preparing for that reality. Financially, she was stable enough to support herself, but the emotional and physical demands of being a single mother weighed heavily on her mind. Could she really do this? Could she navigate through a world that seemed to have turned its back on her? She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the sea of lights below. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, eyes tired but determined. Carolina knew deep down that this wasn't a battle for anyone else to fight. It was hers. She had chosen this path, and now she had to see it through, no matter how hard it became. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the heavy silence. For a moment, she hesitated, expecting another flood of messages she had no interest in reading. But this time, it was different. The name on the screen caught her off guard. It was Mauricio. Her heart skipped a beat. Since the night of the party, they hadn't spoken at all. She had expected him to reach out in anger, to demand explanations, but instead, he had remained silent. Until now. She stared at the screen, the message short and direct. "We need to talk. Can I come over?" A knot formed in her stomach. She had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Mauricio deserved to know the truth about everything. The pregnancy, her decision to raise the child on her own. But she also knew how much this revelation would hurt him. He had been blindsided by her rejection, and adding this to the pile felt like twisting the knife. Still, she couldn't avoid him forever. With a deep breath, she texted back, "Okay, come by tomorrow night." The weight of the impending conversation settled heavily on her shoulders. This would be the last piece of the puzzle she had been trying to hide, the final step in cutting ties with the life she was leaving behind. She wasn't sure how Mauricio would react, but whatever happened, she had to stay firm. This was her decision, and no amount of guilt or pressure could change that. The next day passed in a blur of nerves and anticipation. By the time evening rolled around, Carolina had run through every possible version of the conversation in her head. None of them seemed to end well. When the knock finally came, her stomach twisted painfully, but she opened the door, ready to face whatever was coming. Mauricio stood on the other side, his face unreadable. He stepped inside without a word, his eyes scanning the apartment as if searching for something, anything, to explain what had happened. They sat down in the living room, an awkward tension hanging between them like a wall. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence was unbearable. "I'm pregnant," Carolina said finally, breaking the stillness with the truth she had been carrying for weeks. She watched as Mauricio's face shifted, the surprise quickly turning to something darker, hurt, confusion, betrayal. "What?" he asked, his voice low and disbelieving. "You're pregnant? And you didn't tell me?" Carolina nodded, bracing herself for what was coming next. Carolina sat on the couch, watching the emotion wash over Mauricio's face. The silence in the room was almost deafening. His shock was understandable. She had blindsided him not once, but twice, first with her rejection, and now with the news of the pregnancy. His eyes, which had always been so warm and inviting, were now clouded with confusion and hurt. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice tight, as if struggling to keep his emotions in check. "A few weeks," Carolina admitted, folding her hands in her lap. "I found out before the party, but I wasn't ready to tell you, or anyone. I needed time to figure things out." Mauricio stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "And you didn't think I deserved to know? That I had the right to know?" Carolina could feel the guilt rising in her throat. He wasn't wrong. He did deserve to know, but telling him earlier wouldn't have changed her decision. She just hadn't been ready to deal with the consequences of that conversation. Not then. And even now, she wasn't entirely sure she was ready. "I'm sorry, Mauricio," she said softly, "but I didn't want this to turn into something it's not. I don't want to be with you just because of the baby." His face darkened, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "So, what? You're just going to raise it alone? Do you even know what you're doing?" Her heart ached at his words, the disbelief in his tone cutting deeper than she expected. She had asked herself the same questions 1,000 times. Could she do this? Could she really raise a child on her own without falling apart? But every time the doubts crept in, she reminded herself of why she had made this choice. It wasn't just about her independence. It was about living authentically, raising her child in an environment where love and honesty mattered more than social expectations. "Yes," Carolina said, meeting his eyes. "I know what I'm doing. I want to raise this baby on my own." Mauricio let out a bitter laugh. "You want to do everything on your own, don't you? First, you reject me at the party, and now you're telling me I'm not even needed for this." His words dripped with hurt, and Carolina could see the betrayal in his eyes. "It's not about you not being needed," she tried to explain, her voice faltering. I don't want to bring a child into a situation where we're pretending to be something we're not. I don't want to marry you because it's what's expected. I want to make decisions based on love, not obligation." Mauricio shook his head, stepping back from her as if the distance would somehow protect him from the weight of her words. "You really believe that? You think it's that simple?" Carolina stood up, crossing her arms in front of her, more to protect herself from the growing tension between them than anything else. "It's not simple," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's the right thing for me." Mauricio stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to find some glimmer of the person he thought she was. But whatever he was looking for, it wasn't there anymore. Carolina had changed. She wasn't the woman who had quietly followed the rules, who had lived her life according to other people's plans. She was breaking free, even if it meant breaking hearts in the process. "I thought I knew you," Mauricio said quietly, his voice thick with disappointment. "But I guess I didn't." Carolina swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of his words sink in. She had always cared about Mauricio, but what he was feeling now went beyond disappointment. He felt betrayed, abandoned by someone he had trusted, and there was nothing she could say to make that pain go away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. "I never wanted to hurt you." Mauricio gave a small, hollow laugh. "It's a little late for that." The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Carolina knew this was the end of whatever relationship they had left. Mauricio couldn't stay in her life, not after this. And she couldn't blame him for that. He deserved someone who wanted the same things he did, someone who would walk that path with him. Without another word, Mauricio turned and walked to the door. He paused, his hand resting on the knob for just a second, as if considering one last thing to say. But whatever thought crossed his mind, it stayed with him. He opened the door and left, the sound of it closing behind him reverberating through the empty apartment. Carolina stood frozen in place, staring at the door long after he had gone. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, sliding down her cheeks in hot, silent streams. She wiped them away quickly, almost angrily. This was what she had wanted, what she had chosen. So why did it hurt so much? She moved to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. Somewhere out there, she thought, was the life she had dreamed of. A life of independence, of authenticity, of courage. But for the first time, she wondered if she had the strength to live it on her own. Days passed, and the emptiness in Carolina's apartment only grew louder. Every room felt too big, every corner too quiet. The loneliness had become her constant companion, but despite the sadness and regret that clung to her, she knew she had made the right decision. The path she had chosen wasn't easy, but it was hers. She reminded herself of that whenever the doubt crept in. But just as she was starting to settle into this new normal, the knock came. A slow, deliberate knock at her door that stirred up all the emotions she had tried to bury. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Only one person could carry that weight with him, the unresolved tension of everything left unsaid. She opened the door, and there stood Mauricio, his face a mixture of determination and uncertainty. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days, his usual composed demeanor gone, replaced by someone who had been wrestling with demons of his own. Carolina's heart sank at the sight of him. She hadn't expected to see him again, not so soon, not after the way they had left things. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than she remembered, a plea wrapped in those few words. Carolina hesitated for just a moment, then stepped aside, allowing him in. The familiar scent of him filled the room, bringing with it memories of easier times, times when life had seemed simpler, when she hadn't been caught between what was expected of her and what she truly wanted. They stood in her living room, the awkward silence heavy between them. Mauricio's eyes swept the room, finally resting on her as if searching for the right words to begin. But it was Carolina who broke the silence first. "I didn't expect to see you," she said, her voice calm but guarded. "I didn't expect to come," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "But I can't stop thinking about it. About you, about the baby." Carolina nodded slowly, feeling the familiar knot of guilt and uncertainty form in her chest. She knew what was coming, the inevitable conversation they had to have, but neither wanted to face. She gestured toward the couch, and they both sat, a comfortable distance still maintained between them, as if that space was the only thing keeping the emotional floodgates from opening. "I've been trying to understand," Mauricio began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I've been trying to figure out why you didn't tell me sooner. Why you made all these decisions without me." Carolina swallowed hard, the words she had rehearsed so many times feeling stuck in her throat. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you, Mauricio, but I couldn't let this be something that forced us into a life neither of us really wanted." Mauricio's jaw clenched, and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But that's just it, Carolina. You didn't give me a choice. You made all these decisions on your own. Do you think I wouldn't have wanted to be part of this? That I don't care?" "It's not that," she replied, shaking her head. "I know you care. But caring isn't enough. I didn't want us to be trapped in a marriage that was just a solution to a problem. You deserve more than that. And so do I." Mauricio sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "I don't see it that way. I don't see this as a trap. This is our child, Carolina. Don't you think we owe it to him, or her, to try, to give this a chance? Carolina looked at him, her heart aching. She knew how much he meant those words, how much he wanted to believe that this could work. But she also knew, deep down, that it wasn't the right answer. They couldn't build a life on obligation. Not one that would last. I want what's best for the baby, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I won't bring a child into a relationship that isn't built on love. I care about you, Mauricio, I do. But I don't love you. And that's not something I can force. He stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. The hope he had brought with him seemed to drain from his face, replaced by the familiar hurt that had been there the last time they spoke. So that's it then, he said quietly, the resignation in his voice cutting through the room. You're really going to do this alone. Carolina's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. I'm not doing this to shut you out, Mauricio. I'm doing this because it's the right thing for me, for all of us. I want you to be a part of the baby's life, if that's what you want. But I won't tie you to something you don't truly want. He stood up, his expression distant, as if a part of him had already started to pull away. I don't know what I want anymore, he admitted softly. They stood in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. Mauricio gave her one last look, something unreadable in his eyes, before he turned and walked out the door. And just like that, he was gone again. Carolina stood frozen, staring at the closed door, knowing that she had made the right choice, but still feeling the sting of loneliness in the quiet that followed. Carolina had barely recovered from Mauricio's departure when the next storm arrived. It came in the form of a phone call from her mother, 2 days after the conversation with Mauricio. Her mother's voice was calm, controlled, too controlled. It was the tone she used when she had something important to say, something that was rehearsed, and Carolina instantly knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Your father and I want to speak with you, her mother had said, not asking but demanding. We've been thinking about everything that's happened, and we believe there's still a way to resolve this. Come to the house tonight. 6 o'clock. The click of the phone being hung up left Carolina staring at the screen, her stomach twisting with dread. The rejection she had felt from her family after revealing the pregnancy had been brutal, but something in her mother's voice suggested they hadn't given up on forcing her back into their mold. She knew exactly what was coming. They would try to bargain, to negotiate, but what they wanted wasn't something she could give them. Not anymore. Still, she couldn't avoid this confrontation. The lingering threads of loyalty, of a need for closure, pulled her back to the house she had grown up in. If nothing else, she needed to hear what they had to say and make it clear, once and for all, that she wasn't going to follow their plan for her life. When she arrived at the house, the same sense of foreboding she had felt in the days leading up to the party settled over her again. Her parents were waiting for her in the same formal dining room where so many family discussions had taken place. The room was always immaculate, like everything in their lives, a reflection of their desire for control, for perfection. But tonight, Carolina felt out of place here, like a stranger in her own family's world. Her father sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, while her mother stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out into the darkening sky. Neither of them acknowledged her arrival with warmth or affection. It was clear this wasn't a meeting to repair relationships. It was business. Carolina, her father began, his tone as formal as the setting, we've thought long and hard about the situation. We don't want to see you ruin your life with this impulsive decision. Carolina remained silent, her hands resting in her lap as she listened. She knew better than to interrupt. This wasn't a discussion, it was a lecture. We understand, her mother continued, finally turning to face her, that you've chosen to keep the baby. We don't agree with how you've handled this, but what's done is done. The important thing now is to think about the future, your future, and the child's. Her father leaned forward, his eyes sharp and focused. There's a solution here. Mauricio is a good man. He's willing to do the right thing, to marry you, and provide for you and the baby. We've spoken with his family, and they agree. This can still be fixed. Carolina's heart sank as she realized where this was headed. It was the last-ditch effort to save their reputation, to fix the damage she had done in their eyes. They wanted her to accept a life she had already rejected, one built on obligation and pressure, not love. They hadn't heard a single word she had said about wanting her independence, her freedom. All they saw was the chance to restore the family's image. I can't, Carolina said, her voice steady but quiet. I won't marry Mauricio. Her mother's face tightened, a flash of frustration crossing her features. You're being unreasonable, Carolina. You have to think about what's best for the child. A baby needs stability, a father. You can't do this alone. I can do this alone, she responded firmly, feeling the familiar surge of defiance rise in her chest. I've thought about it more than you can imagine, and I know this is the right decision for me, for the baby. Her father shook his head, his patience clearly wearing thin. You're being selfish. This isn't just about you anymore. You're bringing a child into this world, and that child deserves a proper family. What kind of life are you going to give him or her? You're throwing away every opportunity we've given you. Carolina met his gaze, feeling a calm resolve settle over her. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing to live the life I want, not the one you've planned for me. The silence that followed was thick, her parents exchanging glances as if trying to decide how to break through her resolve. But Carolina knew there was nothing left to say. She had drawn her line, and they weren't willing to see beyond their own desires for her future. Her mother sighed, a long, weary sound, before finally speaking again. We just want what's best for you, Carolina. Carolina stood, the conversation clearly over. What's best for me is making my own choices. Without waiting for their response, she turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her. Outside, the cool night air greeted her like a balm, and as she walked away from the house, she knew she had finally severed the last ties holding her back. The drive back to her apartment that night felt strangely liberating. The air, crisp and cool against her skin, seemed to sweep away the remnants of the life Carolina had just left behind. For the first time, she felt the weight of her family's expectations fully lift from her shoulders. The final conversation had been the closing chapter of a story she had spent years living but never wanted. She wasn't numb, though. The sting of rejection still sat heavy in her chest, the wound of her family's refusal to accept her decisions as sharp as it had ever been. It wasn't easy to walk away from the people who had raised her, even if she had never truly belonged to the life they tried to mold her into. But this pain, the hurt of losing them, was somehow less suffocating than the thought of living the life they wanted for her. As she entered her apartment, the familiar quiet wrapped around her like a blanket. This was her space, her world now, and as lonely as it sometimes felt, it was hers alone. She dropped her keys on the counter, her thoughts swirling. The image of her parents, their disapproval etched into every line of their faces, replayed in her mind. She had always known they wouldn't understand, but the finality of it was sinking in. They had made their offer, and she had made her decision. There was no going back. Carolina walked over to the window and gazed out at the city below. The lights twinkled like stars, the hum of life continuing without pause. Somewhere down there, people were living their own lives, making their own choices, forging their own paths. And now, she was one of them. For years, she had felt trapped in a life dictated by others, each decision weighed down by her family's expectations. From her career choices to her relationships, everything had been measured against the yardstick of their approval. But now, she had broken free. And despite the fear and uncertainty that came with it, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She placed her hand gently on her stomach, feeling the faint swell of her pregnancy. This was the life she had chosen, one full of unknowns, but also full of possibility. The baby growing inside her would be the start of a new chapter, a new journey, and she was determined to make that journey on her own terms. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, half expecting another message from her parents or perhaps Mauricio. But instead, it was a message from a colleague at work, a reminder about the project she had been working on. For a moment, Carolina felt a surge of relief. Work had always been her refuge, a place where she could focus her energy and forget, even for a little while, about the chaos in her personal life. But as she stared at the message, something shifted inside her. The career she had fought so hard to build, the thing that had once defined her sense of self, no longer felt like the whole picture. Yes, it was important, but it wasn't everything. Not anymore. She had always prided herself on being independent, on proving that she didn't need anyone to achieve success. But independence, she was beginning to realize, didn't just mean financial security or professional achievements. It meant making choices for herself, without fear of judgment or rejection. It meant embracing the life she wanted, not the life she had been expected to lead. For so long, she had been afraid to disappoint her family, to break away from the carefully constructed image they had of her. But now, standing here in the quiet of her apartment, Carolina felt a sense of empowerment she had never known before. She wasn't defined by their expectations. She wasn't defined by Mauricio's desires, or even by the whispers of the people in her social circle. She was her own person. And for the first time, she truly believed that. The rejection from her family still hurt, but it no longer had the power to control her. It was just one more step in the process of becoming the woman she wanted to be. A woman who could raise a child on her own, not because it was easy, but because it was right for her. A woman who could navigate the complexities of life without bending to the will of others. Carolina turned away from the window and sat down at her kitchen table, pulling out her journal. Writing had always been her way of processing, of making sense of the tangled emotions inside her. As she flipped open to a blank page, she began to write, the words flowing out of her as easily as her thoughts. "This is the beginning," she wrote. "The beginning of a life where I am in control, where I make the rules, where I choose what's best for me and my child." As the words filled the page, Carolina felt a calmness settle over her. She had faced rejection, by her family, by the man she had once thought she might spend her life with, but through it all, she had found her strength. And in that strength, she found liberation. The morning sun filtered through Carolina's apartment, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. It was a new day, but this time, it felt different. Everything felt different. The weight of the past weeks, her rejection of Mauricio, the confrontation with her family, the loneliness, had shifted. She wasn't running from those things anymore. She had faced them, and now, she stood on the other side, stronger and more sure of herself than she had ever been. Her bags were packed, sitting by the door, ready for the next chapter. The decision to leave the city had come to her quietly one night, like a soft whisper in her mind. It wasn't an impulsive decision, but a thoughtful one. After everything, she realized she needed a fresh start, a place where she wasn't haunted by the shadows of what could have been or the expectations of those around her. She had chosen a small town about 2 hours away. It wasn't too far, but far enough to feel like a new world, a place where she could focus on herself and the baby without the constant reminders of her family's disappointment or the tension of her social circle. It was a town where no one knew her, where she could be whoever she wanted to be. A place where she could build the life she had envisioned when she had first decided to walk away from everything. Carolina stood by the window, looking out at the city she had called home for years. It had been the backdrop to so many important moments in her life, her career successes, her relationship with Mauricio, her struggles with her family. But now, as she stared at the familiar skyline, she didn't feel the same connection she once had. The city no longer felt like hers. It had become a place of memories, but not a place for her future. She glanced at the clock, knowing it was almost time to leave. But before she could, there was one last thing she needed to do. Carolina reached for her phone and dialed the number she had been avoiding for days. Her mother answered after a few rings, her voice cold but curious. "Carolina," she said, her tone as formal as ever. "Hi, Mom," Carolina said softly. "I'm leaving today." There was a long pause on the other end. "Leaving? Where are you going?" "I'm moving," Carolina explained. "I found a place outside the city. It's quiet, and it'll be a good place for me to focus on the baby and start fresh." Her mother's silence stretched on, and Carolina could almost picture her standing there, stiff and disapproving, unable to comprehend why her daughter would make such a decision. "I see," her mother finally said, the words clipped and distant. "And you're doing this alone?" "Yes," Carolina replied. "I'm doing this alone, but it's what I want, Mom. I need this." There was no response for a long moment, and Carolina braced herself for whatever her mother might say next. But instead of the harsh words she had expected, there was something else in her mother's voice, a hint of sadness, maybe even regret. "I hope you know what you're doing," her mother said softly, the frost in her voice melting just slightly. "I hope this is what you really want." "I do know," Carolina said, her voice steady. "And it is what I want. I'm going to be okay." Her mother didn't say anything more, and Carolina knew that was the closest thing to acceptance she would get. It wasn't approval, but it was enough for now. "Take care," she said before hanging up, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over her. She placed the phone down and took one last look around her apartment. It had been her home for years, a place where she had grown, changed, and ultimately found herself. But now, it was time to go. With a deep breath, she grabbed her bags and headed for the door. The drive to the small town felt like shedding old skin, each mile taking her farther from the weight of her past and closer to the new life she was creating. The landscape changed from the bustling city streets to open fields and quiet roads, the noise of her old life fading into the background. When she finally pulled into the driveway of her new house, Carolina stepped out of the car and took in the sight before her. The small cottage, with its ivy-covered walls and a garden blooming with wildflowers, was perfect. It was simple, peaceful, everything she had been looking for. She stood there for a moment, letting the reality of it sink in. This was her new beginning. No expectations, no pressure, just her and the baby, and the future they would build together. She was no longer the woman trying to fit into the mold her family had created for her. She was the woman she had always wanted to be, independent, strong, and free. As she walked up to the door, the soft breeze carrying the scent of the flowers around her, Carolina smiled. The future wasn't certain, but it was hers. And for the first time in her life, that was enough.